I thought I'd give you a quick overview of this really excellent book on electronic warfare by David Adamy. He's written a number of books on electronic warfare, and this is really the best place to get started. So, I'll just walk you through the table of contents here and give you a sense. Now, for those who aren't familiar with electronic warfare, see, the electromagnetic spectrum is all around us. There are many things that we do with radios. For example, we can speak to other people on audio using radio technology. Our voice is modulated into a radio signal, sent across, received, and then decoded, and it becomes a voice again. So there's this going around in the spectrum. Then there is all kinds of digital communication. For example, this is a mesh communications device, and this can use radio to send messages digitally encrypted across the network. So you can use essentially radio for text communications. And because you have mesh functionality, you can also jump from node to node. So these can actually occupy a vast area. There's also all kinds of other stuff that's going on around us in the electromagnetic spectrum. So, for example, here we are in Austin, Texas, and let's look at just casually what we can pick up around us. So, of course, if we were close to the water, we could look at transponders from boats. There's digital communications, there's Bluetooth radios around us, there's satellite data that's being transmitted, there's weather information. But let's take a look at aircraft that are flying over us right now. So we're picking up transponders from these aircraft directly. And if I go into these individual aircraft, you can see here that I can actually visualize them on a map and I can see where they are. So this is an example of all of the information that's going on around us that we think is invisible or you require very special equipment to access. But really, all of this information is on the radio spectrum. And here, for example, between Austin and San Antonio, I can see this American Airlines flight that's transmitting its coordinates and its ID using ADSB down to this receiver. So all of this information is on the radio spectrum, and this is just civilian use cases. In military use cases, there's radar, there's secure digital links, tactical links between aircraft, there's guidance systems, there's satellite communications, localization signals. If you can control the electromagnetic spectrum, you can basically control modern warfare, or at least influence it to such a large degree that you can generate outcomes that are favorable to you and unfavorable to your enemy. Now, coming back to this book, everything that I just showed you, that is sort of the end result of applying radio technology. What this book does is it goes through step by step all of the concepts. For example, decibel values, the fact that decibels are a way of measuring the strength of radio as well as audio, but that this is that operates on a logarithmic scale. In other words, the intensity is reduced by the square of the distance. So it's not a linear way of measuring signal. And this is one of the most important things that you have to understand, because as you increase your power, the expectation is that you'll double your distance, but actually this is not how it works. And this is one of the things that operates against us as we employ radio technology over long range. We talk about, for example, the basic link equation. What is a link? What does it mean to link from one point to another? How do losses propagate? So, for example, again, there's equations and there's math that this book walks you through, which shows you that as your signal propagates over a greater amount of space, the volumetric element of space is again growing geometrically, and therefore the received power is being reduced on a geometric basis, not just on a linear basis. So it goes through and looks at, for example, signals close to the Earth, the interaction with the ground, the curvature of the Earth. It talks about the trigonometry that's involved in those spatial equations that I was talking about earlier. Um, then there's also the concept of Doppler shift, which you are familiar with most likely, but the idea that signals contract and expand based on whether the object transmitting or reflecting them is moving away or is coming closer to you. And this is one of the basic principles that's also used to calculate speed and distance. It goes through all of the antennas. It talks about the different types of antennas. It talks about how an antenna provides gain, meaning an increase in decibels in both transmission and the receipt of signals. It talks about phased arrays, which are really important, and beam steering, which is one of the things that enables AESA radars, active electronically scanned array radars. Then all kinds of different receivers. The basic crystal receivers, where the property of the material is what's providing the frequency of resonance. Then there are things like uh, tuned radio frequency receivers, super heterodyne receivers, where all received frequencies, no matter what they are first translated into a fixed frequency, and all of the filtering and all of the processing of that frequency, the circuits have been optimized for that intermediate frequency, and then you get a lot better noise processing, a lot better signal processing with that. So, and this is actually probably close to 100-year-old technology, but is extremely useful even today. Talks about the components of sensitivity. So, as an example, how sensitive can you make something? There's some physics limitations. One of the components of sensitivity is the background microwave radiation. There's always some noise in the electromagnetic spectrum that you're trying to fight against. Then there is your internal noise from your components that you're using in the receiver, and those are limitations of the components themselves. So these are the types of things that this book really breaks down and walks you through. Then finally, we get to electronic warfare, and first of all, RF threats. So let's say that you have a radar focused on you, being able to detect that. These are broken down as frequency and the components that you have to look at when you're cataloging a signal. What frequency is it coming on? What is the pulse width? And then, of course, the direction of arrival, because many of these signals are directional. um, it goes into all the kinds of tools that you can apply. For example, a signal might come in and it might be interleaved, mixed in with other signals, being able to de-interleave that, and how do you do that in a receiver. Also talks about how you visualize signals. So there's a whole set of uh, sections in this book that go through how you can generate displays for radio on computers, how you can show a modern map-based display, horizontal, vertical situation displays, etc. The next issue, of course, is that now that you've looked at the basic theory, you've looked at where signals are coming from, the directionality, the frequency, etc. How do you search for them? Because as I just showed you with a few devices, there's all kinds of signals that are around us at all times. We're only interested in a subset of those signals when we talk about electronic warfare. We want to discard noise, we want to discard background radiation, we want to discard things like civilian radio broadcasts, but we are interested in other kinds of signals. So, how do you search? How do you do a narrow band search, meaning looking at a small part of the spectrum at a time? How do you look at uh, big, broad sections of the electromagnetic spectrum across gigahertz of search space? Then, the book talks about the signal environment, which I've referenced a little bit. Uh, Finally, it gets into things like low probability of intercept. So now that we've talked about how you can search through EM space looking for signals, well, how do you avoid that? How do you build signals that provide a low probability of intercept. As an example, if you're broadcasting a signal in every direction, then pretty much people can be in at any point and they can look at what you broadcast. They can pick that up with receivers. But if you have a highly directional signal, then by definition, somebody would have to be very close to that directional beam in order to pick up the signal that you've transmitted. Again, this is one of the things that is being done now with AESA radars, where beamforming is being used to create extreme amounts of directionality. So that's one. You also have frequency hopping. So instead of just broadcasting on one frequency where it becomes easy for somebody to tune into that frequency, and once your signal has been found through the search mechanisms described earlier, somebody can tune in and can either jam or listen, etc., attempt to decrypt. But here, if you're frequency hopping all the time, then it becomes harder. You can also combine these different transmission mechanisms. You can chirp, you can basically send small elements of your signal, and you can then combine this with hopping frequencies and directional signals. You can create multiple techniques, all three of these techniques. So, for example, you can spread your message, your signal across the spectrum, spread spectrum. This enhances bandwidth, but it's also better for preventing intercept. There's a whole set of discussions around geolocation of emitters, being able to figure out where an emitter is, because in electronic warfare, you can imagine that that's very important. Where is a radar located? If there are counter battery artillery radars, where are they based? Can artillery take them out? And so all kinds of different techniques to be able to get that. And we come back to Doppler again, that Doppler shift that we spoke about. Of course, you also have things like using multiple antennas where you can receive a signal and then triangulate. There's all kinds of discussions around time of arrival. For example, if you've got two antennas or three antennas, the same signal is received at all three antennas, and you know the exact time of arrival at all three antennas, then using the speed of light, which also happens to be the speed of radio transmissions, you can figure out where the signal got first, second, third. You can create a triangulation based on things like this. Then finally, how do you counter all of this? How do you jam? So, what is noise jamming? How can you build decoys? There's cover jamming, self-protection jamming, such as what aircraft employ. Then you get into power management. You don't have an unlimited power budget. How do you use power in a smart way? How do you directionally focus power? There's all sorts of the classic methods like these velocity and velocity pull-off and range pull-off methods to jam, and it covers all of that. A velocity gate pull-off is basically where a radar is sending a signal, and it expects that signal to be reflected and to come back. And depending on the shift in the sent signal and the received signal, the Doppler shift, the radar is able to figure out whether the aircraft that it's trying to detect is flying away or coming towards it, and what the velocity is. But if you are a smart jammer, you can receive a signal like that, and instead of just sending the base reflection, you can automatically shift the frequency of the signal and transmit something that's slightly off, but over time, the radar is fed with an error that accumulates, and over time, it can't really detect because it's such a minor difference that you're sending back from the jammer each time, but it's doctored, the shift is doctored, that eventually the radar is entirely thrown off. So this is just one example that I've given you. There's all sorts of different types of jamming techniques this book covers. It also covers decoys. Instead of the actual system that the detector, the person running the radar, is trying to detect, can you create additional such um, entities that would reflect the signal or would propagate a signal, transmit a signal, that are decoys, that are not what they want to detect, but something else. All kinds of different decoys, active, passive. So a passive decoy would be something that receives a radar signal and simply reflects it. So Lüneburg lenses are one example, where the signal is received and just the shape and the material used in the decoy uh, sends back a signal which is typically larger and stronger than what a body of that size would reflect, simply because you're using geometry in an anti-stealth way rather than trying to deflect and absorb the signal. You're actually trying to amplify and send as much of it back as possible, so the radar thinks this is an aircraft. There's also active decoys where there is transmission coming from the decoy and it's not just reflecting the radar. So this is useful because, for example, if you've got an electronic intelligence system that's trying to pick you up, rather than a radar which is relying on its own transmitted signal being reflected back, an electronic intelligence system might just be a passive receiver. And if you transmit a signal from your decoy, that remote system can pick that up and think that you are somebody or you're an aircraft where you might just be a small towed decoy. Okay, then it talks about simulation approaches. So this is obviously really complex. The physics of it is complex. The real world environments, the complexity of reflections, active jamming methodologies, passive, all sorts of things being thrown into the mix to confuse you. So this is a really complex environment, the electromagnetic spectrum. So how do you prepare for it? How do you increase fidelity in your simulations? How do you use the core equations that this book covers to build good simulators? So basically gets into, once you have simulations, what do you want to do? Gaming, practice, emulation of threats. Obviously, if you're building a radar or a detection system, you want to test it, and you want to test it before it goes out in production. So how do you emulate a threat? And sometimes this is again part of the complexity of this topic, where you might be dealing with a foe, with a system that you don't have hands on. You've never actually, other than maybe a picture, you haven't really seen, and sometimes you haven't even seen a picture. So how do you deal with all of these things? As you're looking for stuff, how do you scan? Methodologies for scanning and all sorts of techniques. Lobes, as you've seen on emitters, you'll see sometimes a diagram which reflects sort of a lobe like shape, because the transmission of radio signals, depending on antenna design, isn't just like a straight line. There's a lobe like, even when it's directional, a lobe like transmission. So all of those types of things are looked at here as well. Um, Very, very interesting book, really complete book. Goes through quite a bit of the math, but it's not like deadly math. It's math that most people that have taken, maybe calculus classes would be able to look at and really, here, for example, the trigonometry, easy, not particularly difficult to follow. Some of this stuff, again, it's just looking at geometries, it's giving you examples. So this is, again, not very complex. Really, really good book, highly recommended.